So the first one we're going to look at is n squared plus 10n plus 20 equals negative 4. So we need to decide which one's the best method. Is it factoring? Is it completing the square? Is it taking square roots? Or is it quadratic formula? Now before we actually decide, what if you have no idea which one of those to choose? Which one could you always choose? Quadratic formula always works no matter what. So worst case, you use quadratic formula. But the quadratic formula is long and it takes some time. So if you don't have to use it, do you really want to? Probably not. Okay? So which one should we use here? Factoring? You think? No? Can we factor this? How would I factor it? What would I have to do? In order to factor, what do I need to do? You're telling me to subtract 20?
No, add 4.
Okay, if we're going to factor, we need to add 4.
Because it has to equal 0.
Right? Because we need to set it equal to 0. So n squared plus 10n plus 24 equals 0. Then what? Okay, so you're doing completing the square.
That's different.
So I can factor this. How would I factor this? What would I use? The x.
The x, that's what I was going to say. Oh.
So on top is 24. On bottom is 10. What two numbers multiply to 24 and add to 10? 6 and 4. Okay, so my factored form is n plus 6 times n plus 4, and that equals 0. But I actually want to know what n is. How would I solve for n? N plus 6 equals 0.
Yeah.
N plus 4 equals 0, which means n equals negative 6 and n equals negative 4. Great.
That's the answer?
Yep. Is there anything else I could have used, do you think, to solve this one?
Yeah.
You could have used completing the square as well. So this one would have worked with completing the square. You'd get the same answers. The difference is up here, what would I have done?
You would have subtracted 20.
You would have subtracted 20 to start to add your blanks, and then fill it in with b divided by 2 squared.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Okay, so this one I can factor. I can use completing the square. Is there something else I can use? Quadratic formula is an option as well.
For everything. But you can't take the square root, right?
You cannot take the square root. Why not? Why can we not take the square root? Why can't we take the square root? The 10n. Yeah, you can't have those two variables. Okay, because of one's the squared and then you have just the n term, you cannot take the square root. So as soon as you see a second variable is not the right word because they're both n's, but like you see n for the second time or the variable for the second time, you cannot use square roots. Okay, so I can use all three, so including factoring. I cannot take square roots. Are you okay with that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's look at the second one. How about 5a squared plus 13a equals 6? So what can I use to solve this problem?
You can't use
Oh, okay, or we can go with what we can't use. What can't we use?
the one where you like divide it by 2.
So that's completing the square.
Because it's 5a and you can't, nothing goes into 13. 5 doesn't go to 13.
Okay, so hold on. One thing at a time. So Aaliyah just said completing the square. You can use completing the square. Why would we choose not to in this case?
Because we'd be working with fractions.
We would be working with a lot of fractions, right? You'd have to divide through by 5, and both of these terms would be fractions. Do you want to do that?
No, ma'am.
Probably not. Could you? Yes. but that's probably not the best option. We can factor? Okay, and I heard someone say we can't use taking square roots. Why? You see the second A. Okay, so we're going to factor again? So what do I need to do to factor? Subtract 6. So 5A squared plus 13A minus 6 equals 0. How do I factor that? The super X. Do we remember what goes on top? 5 times negative 6, so negative 30. And on bottom? 13. What goes here?
5A.
5A and 5A. So now we're looking for two numbers that multiply to negative 30 and add to 13. Dalen is ready for that. 15 and negative 2. So 15 times negative 2 is negative 30. 15 minus 2 is positive 13. What do I do from there?
So you're gonna 5.
Reduce.
Yeah.
Yeah. That one I can't. So I'm left with A plus 3 times 5A minus 2 equals 0. And just like the first one, we set each factor equal to 0. And then solve. So A equals negative 3 and A equals
2 over 5.
positive 2/5. So we determined that the best way to do this is to factor. What other option is there? Quadratic formula. Okay, I can complete the square, but it would be awful to deal with, but it is an option. And then taking square roots is not an option.
So you can really take square. You can't really use it to take square roots.
Okay, but it's good to be able to identify. Everyone okay with that one?
Yeah.
Okay. What about this one?
4p squared. Okay. Oh, you can. Yeah.
This one's taking square roots.
So you add 6.
We could, but it's not the easiest. So we would add 6 to take square roots. So 4p squared equals 280. Divide by 4.
I don't know what that is.
I do. P squared equals 70.
And then take the square root.
Take the square root. Does 70 break down?
10 and 7. 2.
Does that do me any good?
No.
Nope. So P equals plus or minus the square root of 70.
Well, wow.
Okay. You can factor if you want. You would subtract 274 and you'd have 4p squared minus 280 equals 0. Do you know what you would do from there?
Oh, the X?
You can't do that.
Don't you add the 200? I don't know. I tried.
So
Quadratic.
you could do GCF and then you get this.
Oh.
Okay, so I factored, but what's the way to solve that at this point?
Oh, you can do P minus.
So you'd have to divide by 4, you'd have to add 70, and you'd end up taking square roots anyway. When you get an answer that has a radical, you're either going to use the quadratic formula or take square roots. Okay? So I could use the quadratic formula here. So I would have it here, right? This would be my standard form. What would A be? What would B be? Okay, I'll come back to that. What would C be? Negative 280? Do you see a 1B there? Or a 1P there? So what would B be? 0. Okay, so if that middle term doesn't exist, B is 0. So you can use a quadratic formula, but taking square roots is definitely the easiest for that problem.
I'm good at these, but I just don't know which one is which.
So the nice thing about your test is most of the problems tell you how to solve it, which method to use, but being able to recognize is good. All right, last one that we're going to do.
Okay.
Okay, so let's everyone look at it. What do you think we should do for this one? Move the 8 to the other side. Okay, so that's what I heard first. So 2n squared minus 8 minus 6 equals 0. All right, so we put it in standard form.
Or we can use do the quadratic formula.
Divide by 2?
Quadratic.
No.
Quadratic.
You can't divide what by 2? Well, yeah, 0 divided by 2 is 0. Okay, so if you're going to factor, if we're going to factor, what would we do?
The super F, the X.
GCF. Take out the 2, which is dividing by the 2. So let's see what happens. Okay, so the GCF's out there, and I need to factor this with the X, right? What two numbers multiply to negative 3 and add to negative 4?
3 and 4? Negative 3 and negative 4? Or no.
Negative 3, 4, and negative.
No, it can't be 4. It has to be 3.
No.
Okay, so what are the factors of 3? What two numbers multiply to 3? 3 and 1, right? What ones have to be negative to give me a negative 4? Both of them. But negative 3 times negative 1 is positive 3. You cannot factor this problem. Okay, we can't do any more factoring. So factoring is not an option.
This is the quadratic formula.
The quadratic formula will work.
I was saying that listen to me.
Okay, so what does A equal?
A equals 2.
B equals
8.
negative 8. And C equals negative 6. Now, question for you. Could you solve by completing the square?
I mean, I get. I'm just kidding. I don't know.
You could?
You gotta answer a question with a question.
That's the one where you have blanks?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, you can. Yeah, that's but easier. Just do that.
Oh, yeah. You can just do. No, because. Oh, wait. You have to divide their thing.
Okay,
No,
so
but
let's
the
see.
Negative 6 will have to be negative
Okay,
6 in.
okay, hold on. So, if I'm going to do completing the square, I need to rearrange this.
Yeah.
What do I need to move?
The negative 6
I need to add the negative 6 to this side,
in the
and I need to subtract 8 from that side, right? I can look at either one. So 2n squared minus 8n plus something equals 6 plus something.
Now you have to divide by 2.
Okay, so let's see if this is going to work. Okay. N squared minus 4n plus something equals 3 plus something.
Yeah.
So what goes in that blank? Negative 4 divided by 2 squared.
Negative 2.
Negative 2 squared is 4.
Yep.
Okay.
Now factor it, which is x minus 2.
So n
Or n
minus 2 squared equals 7.
7. Then you do the square root.
Square root. N minus 2 equals plus or minus
square root of
7.
Then add 2.
Add 2.
Then n equals 2 plus or minus
2 plus or minus the square root of 7. So you can do completing the square here. Quadratic formula also works. Factoring we realized did not work, right? We tried to factor and we can't just take square roots.
Yep.
Okay. Worst case, quadratic formula works for every single problem. So if you're like, I have no idea and I don't want to figure it out, then you use the quadratic formula.
Wait, okay, so Miss Burt, when you grade our test, are you going to look at our work too? So, cause
Okay, so the question is, when I grade your test, am I going to look at your work? If the section says, so like it did on the quiz, it says solve each equation by taking square roots, you have to use square roots to solve that. And if you don't, you're not following directions, so you're going to get it marked wrong. There is a section on the test that says choose the best method. At that point, you can choose any method that works. So if that means you use quadratic formula for all of them, that's fine. If that means you factor or take square roots, that's fine. But make sure you read the directions. Okay? Because I need you to know all the steps, but I also want you to be able to choose. Yeah?
Is there one that specifically says use quadratic?
Yes. There's one that's specific. When the directions say use the quadratic formula, yes, you have to use it. When the directions say use the quadratic formula, yes, you have to use the quadratic formula. I don't know.